Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Randall Baier, and we'll discuss books on the struggles of a Chinese Nobel laureate, floods in ancient Rome, the lives of Amish teenagers, the ongoing controversy of intelligent design, and others. Welcome to Rip Rap, Randy.
Glad to be here.
Well, we have a bunch of books to talk about, and one of them is Gao Xinjiang, The Case for Literature, and this is someone who was crowned Nobel Poet Laureate in 2000. The first time in the 100-year history of the Nobel Prize that this honor is awarded to an authority for a body of work written in Chinese. In the same year, American readers embraced Mabel Lee's translation of Gao's lyrical and autobiographical novel, Soul Mountain. It's just a wonderful book. I wish that we could find some way of interviewing him, but there's a certain logistical thing. But his essays include The Case for Literature, Literature as Testimony, Literature and Metaphysics, and The Necessity of Loneliness. And these essays talk about literature as an argument for human existence. So rather than one defined just by national boundaries. So this internationality is quite an effective thing in it. And also, at the same time, believes, while you have the international literature, that the writer needs to stand apart from collective movements to establish his or her own identity. So this is one of these situations where I really regretted that we couldn't interview this person.
Did he come through Ann Arbor at all?
No. And also, the translator is a great translator, Mabel Lee. I mean, she's done wonderful works. So it's the combination of a great thinker in another language and then a translator who can act as the bridge between the two cultures.
So this is a reflection on literature as a whole,
Yeah,
not just poetry itself.
yeah.
It made me think when you said loneliness, I wonder if he's talking about being alone or being lonely.
I
I've
think
always
there's a
wondered
difference between
about that.
loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is when you feel separated from. Solitude is when you're a part of, but by necessity you have to
Be by yourself or
to
reflect
get your
in
thoughts
some way.
together.
Yeah.
And he's gone through some terrible things, in China, even being arrested and all that. I mean, there's quite a history of conflict because he does not agree with, takes, a point of difference.
Right. Thinks his own way,
Yeah.
I guess, yeah.
And it's just a wonderful body of work that he's got going. And it's always fascinating me, too, the difference between Western and Asian argumentation. But what he's got going is something that has appealed to a truly international audience.
Right.
So it's to be celebrated. The next book is, and I had to look this up, I must fess up. And the title of the book is The Pandas Black Box, Opening Up the Intelligent Design Controversy. It's edited by Nathaniel Comfort. Nathaniel Comfort's an associate professor in the Department of History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins Medical Institutions. But you have to know a couple of things, because this got a wicked, I guess, pun in it, or at least there's some additional information. The thing about pandas and design and creationism and evolution is there was this idea about whether pandas were a thing of had a thumb or what that represented. And there was a famous book written of pandas and people, The Central Question of Biological Origins, by Percival Davis and Dean Kenyon, and published by the Texas-based Foundation for Thought and Ethics. And they're the ones that promote this idea of intelligent design, which I think is like one step from creationism. And, and so the other thing is that Darwin had also got, in the fray with the black box theory. So essentially Nathaniel Comfort's taking the position, some people are saying, well, the intelligent design should be treated, just talk about the controversy. He says, what controversy? There's no disputing, I mean, this supposed value of the intelligent design theories is beside the point because it's apples and oranges.
Yes, yeah.
It has nothing to do with each other. You can talk about it in terms of history of thought, you can talk about philosophy. We've talked about that before in the program. But he's saying, what controversy?
And maybe that's the pun on Pandora's box. But once you open something up, you don't know, what's going to come of it. But the pressure to introduce as an aspect of science, the claim that it becomes part of science and therefore should be taught as an essential aspect of what science is about. And science is not about that at all. But you're right, it is apples and oranges, and it seems that putting this into the classroom is where the real controversy comes.
Well, and the wicked fun in terms of riprap is that just because a book is published doesn't mean that it has authentic, credible value. And the Of Pandas and People book, which was published in 1989, there's a lot of pressure around to adopt it. It was intended to be a school textbook.
Yeah, okay.
And there's all kinds of situations where people say, well, we ought to do it. This speaks to intelligence. See, that's proof of intelligent design. Not exactly. And, there's a number of people who regard it as this pure pseudoscience. And that's what Nathaniel Comfort, I think, is indicating. This is beside the point. But the thing was, it was published as a school textbook by this private foundation. And then people started trying to get school boards to adopt it. And so I thought that was interesting. People have taken a look at this whole intelligent design thing, think that it's just, it involves supernatural powers, this. I read one definition of faith is when you run out of everything else, reasons for why something, then you just believe it. And so.
Well, I've heard in discussions of this on radio and in the media, respected scientists who are religious people, whatever their faith may be, but they practice faith, and they don't see any reason to have intelligent design as an element of the scientific process. It's out of the ballpark.
Well, and if you look at the whole concept of design, that presupposes a version of logic and rationality that may be far more limited than what exists. What is our concept of design? Does it have to all be square and everything intersect, or is there, was it theory of chaos? In other words, that within a far more seemingly casual and complex thing, there is some kind of element of organization. But in a way, you kind of admire the impulse for meta theory, but it's not a genuine kind of thing. And this whole thing of the textbook talks about a blueprint, a plan, a pattern, a design.
Yeah.
And I keep thinking, boy, this is such a Western, trip to the New World. This is trying to find something that may or may not be there.
Yeah, that's a good metaphor. That's true. That's true. And it is true that out of the randomness of nature, there are patterns that come about. And I like to think that it has to do with the functioning of the brain, or the functioning of major natural systems, or whatever. The spinning of the earth or whatever that causes things to happen because of other impulses.
Well, I found it fascinating that the whole misinterpretation is just about, does a panda have a thumb? Well, a thumb is kind of a colloquial term for a very specific bone.
Well, there's that. You probably came across the book by Stephen Jay Gould where he addressed this issue in terms of natural selection. But wasn't his book called The Panda's Thumb or something of that nature? He talked about pandas, about whales, about humans, and the whole impact that this this bone had.
But my thing is, the colloquial informal usage, you call it a thumb, but it's actually a sesamoid bone that has evolved.
Yeah.
And in scientific terms, we need to look at the specific, those names that seem so complicated to remember actually are a system of classification for different kinds of bones.
Yeah.
So this thing we call thumb, there isn't like thumb bone, finger bone, they're named in order to put them in some categories and classification system.
Yeah.
So I just thought that it's a very interesting book by very serious scientists, and he has other articles by people who are addressing different parts of it. But that whole thing of the debate, I thought that's pretty interesting. And then we have one, Knowing the Enemy, Jihadist Ideology and the War on Terror, and here we go again, about, well, what are we going to do as a result of 9/11? It's just one of my perverse, thinking, the scholarly. This is Mary Habak is the author, and she's associate professor at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. She's also co-editor of Spain Betrayed the Soviet Union in the Spanish Civil War and the Great War in the 20th century. So she's interested in things as conflict, and I think it's a useful thing to try to understand the enemy, because if you genuinely did that, then you try to understand the mentality and what are the components of it.
To understand the jihadist perspective in order to...
Instead of putting all these emotional, stereotypical kind of thinking on it, to really understand.
Right.
And that's that old thing we've talked about before. The difference between the terrorist and the liberation fighter is nothing. I mean, it's the same person looked at from different viewpoints.
From a different filter. I take it that she agrees that the term enemy has some meaning in terms of...
Well, I thought it's interesting that even she's having trouble working this all out, because her previous work is so much earlier. It's World War I and the Spanish Civil War.
Right.
But yeah, it's an attempt to understand who is regarded as enemy. And I think that's a useful discussion for us to think about, instead of, painting it over with just stereotypical thinking.
This reminds me of the commentary in it's in the popular culture context of the movie Good Morning Vietnam, where Robin Williams, the character, the DJ character who has the Vietnamese friend, who turns out is a member of the resistance, the Viet Cong Liberation Front, and he runs into this neighborhood in Saigon after him to confront him about this, and he says, I was here, we're here to help you, fight the enemy. And then the boy yells back at him, you're the enemy. Don't you understand that? You're the enemy.
That's a good point, though. Who is the enemy in a war?
That's right.
Each side says it's the other one.
Right, and there's other sides within. There's so many shades of this. He finally looks around and he realizes he's in this enclave, in this urban enclave of small apartments and houses, and everybody is Vietnamese around him, and it suddenly hits him that he really is the outsider.
He got involved with that guy because that's the brother of the woman that he is pursuing as a romantic interest.
That's right.
And is deeply smitten
with her.
Right.
He starts teaching English and becomes involved with
culture.
And they like him. I mean, they think he's a genuine person, but obviously they can't.
Another scene from that movie, which is also relevant to this book, is when they're sitting in the bar and there's an explosion.
And the boy knew about it.
Yeah.
Right, pulls him out.
That violence does happen. This isn't an accidental, abstract kind of discussion. There's real-time violence happening for people on both sides.
Yeah.
As they're trying to sort out, well, who is the enemy and what's going on.
Yeah. Floods of the Tiber in Ancient Rome by Gregory Aldrete, or Eldrete. And I see he did another book called Aqueduct Hunting in the 17th century. So he's obviously involved in the water issues of history. But the book talks about approaches. How did the Romans deal with the flooding of the Tiber on a regular basis? And did they think about it? And what's the history of urban flooding in terms of what the Romans did? Because they had such power to move water, but it doesn't seem like they actually dealt with the floods of this river.
This is a fabulous parallel to the United States and the levees in New Orleans.
Yeah, actually, great. That's great. Yeah.
I thought that's when first as I heard about
it didn't even occur to me till you just said that.
Because it's the same thing. We are an empire.
Right.
We're trying to deal. Water is an essential ingredient to the health and welfare and industry, but we don't handle it all that well. And also, we run out of money to manage it, and also motivation. And so the same thing happened with these floods with the Tiber River.
Yeah.
Is that they were running out of money, and it was getting, a taxing kind of, it was becoming a very big challenge to keep dealing with this thing. And so they had something that was quite a bit like Katrina, the flooding, overwhelming flooding happening. And it's the same thing I've read about China. this same thing as a valuable resource at times can also overwhelm an area and cause
Yeah,
death and
right.
havoc. And so I thought the same thing, like they're finding out now that the hurricane, the levee system, there's attempts by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to manage the water, and the cuts that they made into the city helped flood the city when they had
When the flood happened.
when the hurricane came in, because it pushed all the water
Yeah.
that much faster in. And there's elements
Because there
of
was a
that.
channel for the water to go in.
Errors made by the empire in trying to manage it, because they become more and more radical, saying, oh geez, every time we're having to go back and take care of this thing, actually if you play it out in long term, ends up undercutting and the whole process.
Yeah.
And so I thought this is an example where ancient history isn't so ancient. It really is that thing about coming back on and doing it one more time.
Yeah, this is interesting. It'd be interesting to look at this in comparison to the flooding of the Nile and Egypt.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, which was, I guess, never got maybe, I don't know, historians would disagree with me, I guess, but I mean, it didn't seem to get quite to the extent of the Roman Empire in certain ways.
Well, see,
An
empires are
empire
built
and
all
a-
about power and
Yeah.
organizing yourself.
Yeah, and
that
I mean, they were
somehow
certainly
you'll
organized.
take care of it. And I love these instances when the empire just can't do it.
Yeah.
All
yeah.
the things that would work for more minor.
But in their case, they lived with the Nile. I mean, it had such a regular cycle that in terms of the building and crops and the organization of agriculture, it had to do with balancing that regular flooding every year.
And sooner or later, it'll do it in a way that you just can't believe that would be that much water. I mean, there's still pictures coming out of how the water is still around in some places
Yeah.
in the Ninth Ward in New Orleans,
Yeah.
and how they're still trying to recover from that. And so I just thought, man, that's wonderful.
Good point for a segue.
That's right.
Because look what's coming up.
And this was entirely
Growing up
random.
Amish.
But the interesting thing
The
about
teenage
this,
years. This is interesting.
what he's looking at is that the Amish kids stay Amish.
Yeah.
90% of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And whereas in the more conventional society, 90% of the kids are rejecting whatever their
Yeah.
parents' inclination and
yeah.
practices are.
And is this because they're given a time period to think it over, have some freedom, and make a commitment
What's
to...
interesting is they're actually given some flexibility
Yeah.
in the parenting. So there's rules, but then if they don't, comply with the rules, there's penalties. But they're not like ostracized. They're not. It's not. Because I think the expectation of parents is sooner or later these kids will fall in line. That they'll make that commitment, and they want them to experience some things. They're very specific. I mean, their dances are from between 8 and 10. They don't have churches, so they're at people's houses.
Right.
And they're not, it's very, very specific rules about how all this is supposed to happen. And I just thought it was interesting that the Amish kids ultimately enjoy this and find it meaningful and satisfying to them as people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I couldn't also help but think about that terrible situation last year with the shooting in the schoolhouse, and how they forgave the person that did the shooting, but they also tore down the schoolhouse,
Did they? This I didn't know.
Demolished it.
Right.
went 200 yards away from
Okay,
it,
and
so
built
it
a
wasn't,
new one?
and built a new one. Only this time it's farther back so that people can't. Other people have a little farther to go to get to it.
Okay.
I thought it was, and then the one woman that was a teacher there named her child after one of the girls who died. And I also thought it was just so impressive that one of the girls, when they were starting to shoot him, volunteered to be first. So I mean, there's this thing about community, about forgiving, about organizing yourself, about recovering from tragedy. That's just really interesting. And so when I saw this book come along, I wanted to try to understand the mentality of people who live in that kind of environment.
Well, this book was being written while that happened, so it's not timely. It doesn't mention
Not
that
exactly,
event.
it's a parallel. But
Yeah.
I found it interesting because it gives an insight into the mentality. And I think that too often the Amish regard as a peripheral, a marginal group there's someone say, oh yeah, the Amish, and like everyone seems to know what that is.
Right, and you don't know.
But this
how
particular scholar took, that's his area of study,
Right,
and so
right.
he was able to really do some serious research on it. And I thought that was helpful for
That's
me.
good. Yeah.
Because I don't understand it. I mean, I don't understand how someone could shoot up your kids, and the first impulse they had was to forgive, very first, and they feel totally committed to that. And I think that also may have something to do with why their young people take on that commitment. If they feel that, now there's something to resonating at a very deep level with them, answering their needs. And maybe part of it is that forgiving thing. That it has this cyclic nature to it that comes around.
Yeah, apparently they helped the woman the wife of the man who was the perpetrator.
Yeah,
they helped her.
Keep helping her. They keep into that. They brought her into the community in a way. And they offer her the decision whether or not she wants to do it. But they went to the funeral, of the guy, and they tried to help out the family. Never intrusive, but always just including them and inviting the family to attend their funerals. Very, very interesting in this day and age where there's drive-by shootings,
and resentment.
random violence.
It just increases.
So this random violence,
Right.
and mortal violence. There is this element to the random nonsense that the Amish way of caring about people, developing community, I find really fascinating.
So just to recap, the book is Growing Up Amish, The Teenage Years by Richard A. Stevick, by Young Center Books in Anabaptist and Pietist Studies. Professor Stevick is from Messiah College in Grantham, Pennsylvania.
It seemed quite often you'd think that he would have quite a limited viewpoint. It was published by somewhat of a specialized publisher.
Yeah.
But I think that it depends on the work, and I found this work helpful.
Finally, it looks like we've got a biography of Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville, A Life, by Hugh Brogan, Yale University Press. Yale's definitely on your list today.
Yeah, that's right.
Now this is interesting. Maybe I've been seeing references to this book, but I've seen references in the press lately to Tocqueville.
Yeah.
And he's and in sort of in general reading, you come across articles in articles in academic journals that I tend to browse here and there, and he's sort of getting a rejuvenation.
I don't normally like to talk about biographies because a lot of them are rather specific and limited. But this one's brilliant because, first of all, it's careful research. I mean, Hugh Brogan really did, if you look at the citations he got, did some wonderful, careful primary and secondary research, and some of them are on documents that are not available commonly, in other countries. So he did some careful research with that. But the other thing is just what you're talking about. People throw around de Tocqueville's name like, oh yeah, it's kind of like a joke almost. Well, yeah, nobody. But he was one of the greatest political thinkers of all time. And while he was born a French aristocrat, he wrote, after his travels to America, but he was really reflecting on a very deep level and observing. So what's of value is not only what he saw in American culture, but we also saw with the French Empire.
Yeah.
And so the ancient regime and the democracy in America are important foundational works to understand both countries. And also I think it contributes to discussion in the West about, well, what is democracy? How do empires work? And so this guy really works it through, it's not only a biography, it's really almost kind of like intellectual history in terms of how was he educated, what was he doing, how did he study, what was he involved with, what were his trips and voyages, how did he observe the Republic. Also wrote about prisons, that reflects Foucault's fascination with that, because prisons tell a side of an empire. Those are the people who have violated the rules.
Right.
Well, then what were the rules, and what were they violating, and how thoroughly were they enforced?
Yeah, that's right.
And then, fame that he got for doing this, and then his political thing, and then writing about democracy, and some rather extensive ways, and then a retrospection about how did this all come together. But the important thing is, as Brogan points out, it's not only that, but it's writing about history and writing about revolution. How does this all work together? And so I think it's an important book that almost ought to be mandatory for people going to throw around this guy's name, de Tocqueville.
We should learn a little bit
They
more
should really
about,
read
right.
the book about the guy.
Yeah, like I said, it might be a response to this biography that his name's come about. But also there seems to be, you know, now in the press, due to, I think, a lot about this problem we have now in society, in our society, about the rights of the individual and the rule of law and things of that nature. Maybe this is why, you know, his reflections on what democracy meant to Americans in the 18th century is now coming. You know, the new America is now being talked about again.
Well, you juxtapose the book we've got about the emergency constitution, and then, you know, democracy and its principles, and what de Tocqueville was. There is a kind of there is a very big discussion going on. What is a democracy? How can it function under the different circumstances? In circumstances that perhaps de Tocqueville didn't, you know, or I think he even pointed to it, because if you're looking at the French Revolution, that was a response to empire in its own way.
Yeah.
You know, that you've got to do what the people want you to do. You can't just kind of steer it off and violate that.
Yeah, it's interesting today because our government, current government or regime, if you want to put it that way, I mean, we're, in a sense, trying to export democracy to areas where, ironically, our democracy grew out of a people. Now we're trying to sort of export it in a top-down kind of fashion, as if it's something that we.
Well, the thing that I really respect de Tocqueville is that he wanted to observe firsthand how it was working.
How it was happening. Yeah.
So he observed it in France, and he observed it in this country.
Yeah.
And I think the underlying observation he was making is it is unique, like you're saying, how it's cultivated depending on the nature of that place.
Yeah.
Each one has similarities, but they also have distinct differences. And there's that wonderful characteristic, I think, of French writing that's very specific in noting the differences rather than smoothing it all over and generalizing too quickly. And so that's why I think the work is still sturdy. It's a compliment to him and to his work and the carefulness he did use with it, that it still has value, you know, for scholarship today in understanding history, like Rogan was talking about, understanding how history is written and revolutions reported. Well, that's
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was the art of the segue today, I think. You had, one thing went to another.
Well, thank you for being on Rip.
You're welcome. Yeah, this was an interesting group of books.